Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. This is the first episode of 2023 and I'm very glad to have Professor Ashoka Mody from Princeton School of Public and International Affairs with us. This is on the sidelines of a new book that Professor Mody has written. This is the book. It is very provocatively titled India is Broken. And he goes on to say why it's hard to fix. I would really urge all of you to read the book. It is thought-provoking for two reasons. One is obviously the content. Professor Mody has drawn a huge arc from pre-independent India to the current time and explained why India's political system has failed Indian people. In particular, he has used the metric of unemployment or jobs as the way to explain why that failure has happened or how that failure has happened. And it is also thought-provoking in the way it is written. It will force you to reconsider your views. And to be honest, as a reporter, this is the India that I see more often than the one that one tends to hear about even in the broader media. So I'm very glad to be talking to Professor Mody. Thank you, sir, for taking time out and talking to us. I would like to sort of start off with a question about the timing of the book and what you say. While I agree that unemployment is one of the massive issues in India's polity, in particular today. The notion in popular imagination is that India is the bright spot of global economy. You routinely hear top industrialists and many in the government arguing that India is the land of opportunities over the next 20, 30 years. This is where all the big things will happen. We have some data also to buttress many of these claims where India has overtaken UK, although not in per capita income terms. There are also reports from investment bankers and the like who claim that in the coming 10 years, India is likely to overtake other big economies like Germany and Japan and become the third largest economy. So given the sort of euphoria around this being India's moment, what triggered the desire to write this one and sort of puncture that balloon, as it were?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the kind words you have for the book. I would just add on the book itself, I hope that people will find it easy to read. I've made a big effort to make it readable and enjoyable, even though the story is a grim one. You never time a book like this to a particular moment. This book has been in the making at least for 4 years. It's been in the making for much of my adult life. I have been continuously motivated by asking a series of questions. Why do more than 40% of Indian workers still work in agriculture? Why is urban employment so anemic? Where are the honorable jobs for most Indians? Why are our children poorly educated? Why is healthcare such a major risk for most Indians? Why, for example, does a healthcare emergency create a financial catastrophe for vast numbers of people? Why is the air not clean? Why is the water not clean? Why are the rivers dying? To take a contemporary example, why is Joshimath sinking? Why does the judicial system not work for the average people? I have, while there has been much celebration about some animal that people call GDP growth, I've been asking, what is the lived reality for vast numbers of people? It so happens that the moment at which this book is coming out, that mythical GDP number of $5 trillion and $10 trillion suddenly has become even more prominent than in the past. Exactly at the time when the livability issues that I'm talking about have, if anything, become worse. So the disconnect that you see was always there. And it's that disconnect that prompted me to write it. So happens that that disconnect today is just great. So the moment of writing this is therefore prompted by the fact that when you say there is a view that this is India's moment, I have for long believed that the so-called India story is a story told by a small elite that lives first world lives. And in that world, India is on the move. In that world, things are pretty good. You go away from that elite world and you come down just a little bit, the India story changes. There's also, to be clear, completely clear, the first world elite Indians are to some extent mirrored in the West. There is some narrow geopolitical concern that India will be a counterweight to the Chinese might. I think that that belief is completely unfounded. I'm not a strategic expert, so I'm not going to comment on it. But to the extent that that is the basis for revving up the India story, I think that is completely misfounded. The people who focus narrowly on economics, like the Economist had a cover story, India's moment. So I studied it carefully. They say three things. There's a unified public, what interface? UPI?
UPI.
Yeah. Payment interface. There is startups,
unicorns.
and there is an Apple factory that is coming up somewhere near Chennai. Okay. We can talk about all of them, but let me just for a moment focus on UPI, because UPI has become so large in the imagination of the India story. The question I ask is the following. Is UPI going to prevent Joshimath from sinking? Is UPI going to prevent the fact that Hasdeo forests are being cut down? Is UPI going to solve the problem of Aravali's being denuded? Is UPI going to educate my children? Is it going to improve healthcare? Is it going to improve the backlog in the prison system, where 70% of the prisoners are under trials, where judicial torture, custodial torture is common? The UPI works for the elite Indians. And true, I acknowledge that there are some people will say, Ki, the chai vendor next to my house, he also uses UPI. That's great. That's great. I'm not saying that that's not an achievement. What I'm saying is, it still doesn't educate my kids. It still does not improve my health care. It still does not clean my air. The river Musi that runs through Hyderabad is still dying. If we ignore those problems and we assume that those problems will be solved somehow through UPI or through startups, then who exactly is smoking something illegal over here?
This whole notion that we have not achieved anything. No, the reason why I asked this particular question is that while it is true that any one of these things, UPI or Aadhaar or any of these things may not solve all the other things, it is very easy to imagine India having lost its way in the 75 years of its existence, as we've seen Pakistan apparently lose its way. And for a very diverse country and a large country like India, there have been several achievements, many for whom we should be very proud. We may not have achieved everything, but there is obviously a tremendous sense that we are growing with every passing decade, and trying to achieve the potential that we had. So it is in that perspective that I ask that is this about setting the record straight, and bringing in infusing a certain amount of reality in the way we see of how far we've achieved and what not?
Look, so let us agree that Pakistan is much worse condition than we are. Did not want to make that kind of comparison because I think that is setting the bar too low. We can also say we are better than Haiti is. We can also say that there is no crime running rampant all around the country. I'll tell you a little story. When I was at CDS in Trivandrum, Professor Gulati, a very eminent economist of his generation, I said to him one day, our library is very nice. And he looked at me, he was fond of me, and he said, Ashok, you're usually a sensible guy, but if you compare everything with Bihar University, everything is going to look nice. Therefore, my point of comparison has been with countries that incidentally were behind us. Korea, China. A little known fact is that up until about 1980, the Chinese per capita income was lower than India's. China has come from below and gone like that. Bangladesh is not only growing faster in terms of this GDP animal, but human development indicators. If we don't set our eyesight on those that have gone past us, and large numbers have gone past us, then celebrating the fact that we have done better than Pakistan, I think is sort of both trivial and also in a sense a very dispiriting conclusion.
Right, I agree. Let me ask you about the fundamental metric that you've used in the book. You've said that you very purposefully moved away from focusing on GDP to analyze India's success, and you've actually talked about unemployment as the central metric. From my own experience in the past, having talked to policymakers and top economists, the notion in India has been that without GDP, nothing will happen. There will be no poverty alleviation, there will be no job creation, there won't be too much social welfare. And GDP growth is the necessary condition, and that's why everybody just focuses on GDP growth. So my questions are twofold. One, why did you choose unemployment? And two, do you think Indian policymakers can ignore the importance of GDP and sort of focus on other issues like unemployment?
Look, we need growth. Let's stipulate that that's a truism. We are not contesting that. Okay? The problem with GDP is twofold. So as you were saying, a few minutes before we started. If Gautam Adani was walked through this door and come here, the per capita income of all of us would go through the roof, right? Okay. So there's that issue of how it's distributed. If we build a petrochemical plant, GDP growth goes up. And we also need a petrochemical plant. But if GDP growth goes up and we employ 5 people and we don't give them health care and we don't give their children education, then we have to ask ourselves, look ourselves in the mirror, why aren't we doing that also? ये तो नहीं कि पेट्रोकेमिकल प्लांट बना दिया, जीडीपी बढ़ गई, तो बच्चों को नहीं पढ़ाना है, स्वास्थ्य नहीं करना है. Okay, that's one thing. The other more serious problem with GDP is if I pollute the rivers, if I denude the hills, if I pollute the air, then in the first example where the inequality is in the present, at least there's a possibility that those who are at the receiving end of the poor unequal distribution can speak. But when we are taking away the air and the water and the resources of future generations, we are not even giving them a voice. Now, I have been struck since I wrote the book, the Joshimath sinking is not just Joshimath sinking, it is symbolic. It is symbolic of a development pattern where construction is the centerpiece. In 1976, the MC Misra committee said, this is fragile land, don't build here, or build here with a lot of care. My friend Ravi Chopra, for years the fellow has been saying, these are delicate mountains, build here but don't cut the slopes in this fashion, don't remove the forests from here. Today, Ravi says, the fact that he has been proven 100% correct makes him sad because the outcome is so tragic. Joshimath ka to we are hearing. What about the rest of Garhwal? The river Musi runs through Hyderabad. The pharmaceutical industry has been putting its pollutants into the river Musi. River Musi is dead. Who is going to bear the cost of that? Where is the accounting for that? So GDP is growing because pharmaceuticals are being produced. But are we subtracting the amount that it will cost our children to revive River Musi? So GDP to ho gayi hamari. But what kind of fictitious number is that? Whereas employment gets to the lived reality of people. The lived reality which includes education, health, clean air, judicial system, livable cities. That lived reality is what we should be asking ourselves. We cannot 75 years after independence say that we will grow our GDP at all costs and employment will come. When will employment come? Education, take education. Sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s, we finally achieved universal primary education. Well after the Koreas, Taiwans, Chinas had done so. But then the quality of education has been so abysmal. A 5th grader cannot solve 2nd grade math problems and so on. उसका नतीजा क्या होता है कि 5th, 6th standard में 10% of the children stop going to school. When they make the next transition to 9th to 10th, another 25-30% drop out of school. It is not a well-known fact that 30-35% of Indian children do not finish high school. We are talking about a knowledge economy. We are talking about a UPI and so on. But if 30-35% of Indian children don't finish school, and those who do finish school go to these rubbish colleges where they get certifications and then they apply for these railway jobs. 12.5 million people applied for 35,000 jobs. For every one person who would get the job, 350 would not. And the railway has not even delivered even on that miserly promise. And then you ask yourself the even deeper question, why railways? Why doesn't the private sector generate jobs? And everybody who talks about market liberalization and capitalism hona chahiye, I say bring it on, but then give people a fair chance. Give people a chance to participate in that activity in an honorable way, in a dignified way. Give them the support they need so that they are able to say, yeah, this is something where I can try and there is a reasonable chance I will succeed. Hence the focus on employment, because that is the fulcrum around which opportunities in this generation and in future generations apply.
Do you find it odd that, in the Western world, you're talking about US, even the Federal Reserve always talks about inflation, the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It's never bothered about the GDP growth per se.
Because that's a very important observation you have made. The US Fed has what they call a dual mandate. The dual mandate says we need to keep inflation low, and recently in Ben Bernanke's time they decided it should be below 2%. But the Fed also has the employment mandate, and the employment mandate is full employment. In other words, the US Congress has stipulated that the US Federal Reserve, the central bank, will also bear in mind employment considerations. There is a trade-off sometimes between employment and inflation, and the central bank has to deal with that trade-off. But it does not mean that you lose sight of that crucial objective. Because very few people in the United States will know what GDP growth is. But everybody knows what the unemployment rate is.
So tell me something, this is very crucial because in India's context, notwithstanding all the data around unemployment, that unemployment has been on historic highs, there is a certain denial, very distinct denial within policymakers when it comes to unemployment. So it's not just about taking something beyond GDP into consideration, but it is a distinct denial to look at unemployment data. And regardless of whether one believes or agrees with the, say, methodology of a private data provider like CMIE, there is, we routinely hear policymakers in the government berating every time CMIE data shows, puts up an inconvenient fact about unemployment. So how do you sort of look at this whole, the politics around unemployment in India that just don't look at it or not talk about it?
I mean, there's a simple answer and there's a more complex answer. The simple answer is the one I gave you. That if the story is being told by a narrow elite that lives first world lives, they don't care. I mean, I'm struck by how many times there are macroeconomic assessments done of India. And the word employment doesn't show up. Then it literally does not, I mean, it's not that they make up fake facts, which often they do when they do talk about it, but they don't even talk about it. Because in their world, what's the problem? You know, in this movie, Dil Chahta Hai, 2001, what's his name? Amir Khan? Amir Khan. At the party at which the students graduate, he goes up to the mic and speaks and says, it's now time to look for a job. And in that elite crowd, there is a stunned silence. What does it mean to look for a job? And then he says, when everyone looks so crestfallen, he says, just kidding, yaar. Because they don't, their jobs are all sewn up. Amir Khan himself, as the character, if you remember, goes to Australia to run a business that his father owns. So, in that world, there's no problem. But you talk to people. See, I just want to make one further clarification on employment. The CMIE people are doing a fantastic job, okay? And Mahesh Vyas is a true visionary. But as Ajit Ghosh will tell you, again and again and again, the phrase unemployment rate is a meaningless phrase for India. So the phrase unemployment rate is a meaningless phrase for India. And I see that even economists who talk about the unemployment rate get misled. So I'll give you an example. Some years ago, just here in a community center in Saket, I asked my gym instructor, "Tum din mein kya karte ho?" And he said to me, "मैं time pass करता हूँ." Now you notice the word time pass has become a noun. You do not pass your time, you do time pass. The do time pass is a vast phenomenon. So my gym instructor, spent much of his time in the gym and at home watching cricket. But the point Ajit Ghosh is making is that there is vast underemployment. He's saying that 5 people may be doing the work of 1 person. If you stopped 4 people from that job, that 1 person would be as productive as 5 people. What that means is the unemployment is much bigger, much vaster, because people share their jobs. Take agriculture. Agriculture में तो underemployment ही underemployment है. You work only in certain seasons. There are families that share work. So so what Ajit Ghosh does is he computes something called a backlog of employment. That was the terminology, that is not Ghosh's terminology, that is terminology that goes back to the first and second plan. What do? They say, if we were to fully employ everyone, how many more jobs would we need to create? And Ajit Ghosh had estimated that at the time of the 2017-18 survey, the NSS survey that comes out, that the backlog was about 80 million people.
80 million?
Yes. Uske baad COVID has struck, and my crude estimate is that COVID has added something in the range of another 40 million people. Why? Because in those 2-3 years, something of the order of, let's say, 8 million people every year have come additionally on stream, plus some people who lost their jobs have not got their jobs, plus, and this is very important, a lot of people have gone into this state of so-called self-employment.
True.
Self-employment is just a euphemism for underemployment. काम नहीं है तो you say कि मैं self-employed हूँ. So if the backlog today is somewhere in the order of 120 million people, and over the next 10 years we need another 8 million jobs every year, then in the next decade we need 200 million jobs. Yeah. If the backlog is 200 million people and we have not created any jobs in the last 10 years, pre-COVID we had probably a net zero according to Ghosh. According to me, if we include COVID period, net negative. Remember, this is also a low number. Why? Because only 25% of women are in the workforce. So Ghosh is assuming that the low participation rates more or less continue. If, for example, we were to increase our participation rate, then the required levels of jobs will balloon. So in a sense, we are dealing with this odd problem that the low participation rates are giving us a sense that the problem is vast and insurmountable, but it could be much worse.
Yeah, I mean, I remember talking to Mahesh Vyas of CMI, and he often talks about looking at the employment rate instead of the unemployment rate because of the underlying fact that the participation rates in India are low.
Yeah, participation rates are low. That part Mahesh Vyas is 100% right. What Mahesh Vyas does not able to do is the underemployment. And what Ghosh will tell you, that for every person who is unemployed, there are probably 4 or 5 people who are underemployed.
Right. Now, this brings me to a broader question, and you've explained right through from Nehru's time to Prime Minister Modi's time how we have progressively, the fact that we did not have employment as our real focus and we didn't deliver on that, it worsened the quality of our society. It engendered social unrest, which showed up in different ways. And the most recent turn that you talk about is the turn towards radical Hinduism. What my query is, we are a country where governments have been brought down for high inflation or onion prices in Delhi. We are also a country where GDP growth has had some impact on the political narrative with, say, the last phase of Dr. Manmohan Singh's government being brought down, saying that running the Indian economy aground. Why is unemployment never a political issue? Especially we've seen in the last 10 years and more particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, where even by government data it shows that it's at historic highs. Why is that never turned into a political issue to get solutions? Why something else?
You're asking a very important but also a very complex question. So go back a little bit. Now, this is where history becomes important. The first social protests that reflected, and they always reflected a combination of inflation and unemployment. I place more or less in the period of the Naxalbari agitation. Initially, Naxalbari was about agrarian issues in Naxalbari itself, but quickly it also came to Calcutta, where the Presidency College students, the urban side of that protest movement. So what happened there was an extraordinary state repression. Essentially, Siddharth Shankar Ray under Mrs. Gandhi wiped out a generation. The term that we use today called encounters is born at that time. And police officers who executed these encounters then and ever since have become folk heroes. This comes back to my notion of elites, because they view these protests as deeply subversive to a broader cause that they are trying to espouse. So one of the things that happens when there are employment related protests is a very heavy state repression. That then comes also to Navnirman riots in 1974. JP's protest was a combination of inflation, corruption, but also driven in Bihar by employment issues. And then somehow in the 90s, with this so-called liberalization, the employment issue gets diffused somewhat. What happens then is that agriculture continues in distress. The IT jewel shines brightly. And IT is now drawing in the creamy layer of this country. And there are some jobs being created in construction, as they say, more gardeners. The IT folks need more gardeners and drivers and so on. So there is a little bit of a vent that is released at that time. But then starting, and we don't know exactly when, because the surveys, one is 2011-12 and the next is 17-18. तो उस 10 साल में there are two major shocks. There's the demonetization and there is the GST rollout. And that is the period in which employment stagnates. That problem hits the informal sector. These are people who are sitting in the kirana shops and so on. Out of sight, they are doing time pass, exactly. You know, I don't want to distract you with stories, but I was buying a shampoo 4 or 5 years ago, and I went to Saket Market, and there's a lady there sitting there. Everyone calls her Auntie Ji. She looks younger than me, but I also call her Auntie Ji. Auntie Ji, मेरे को shampoo चाहिए. अरे बेटा रामू जरा आना. तो रामू कहीं से आता है, and Ramu shows me some shampoos, and Ramu scampers away. Now, the question I ask my students is, are Auntie Ji and Ramu employed? The technical phrase will be they are self-employed. But are they employed? So there's a huge element of time pass going on over there. But the point is, it's people like them who got hit by these shocks, and then more so by COVID. They are not a natural constituency to create a political lobbying group and a group that can mobilize around some kind of social and political protest. The gig workers now, there's this morbid celebration of gig workers, which I find utterly reprehensible. You know, naukri बढ़ रही है. A gig worker who has a cycle earns between 5,000 and 7,000 rupees a month. Somebody who has a motorcycle probably earns about 15,000 rupees a month. And he has all his expenses. We are creating this very diffuse workforce which is not able to mobilize around a cause. the combination of threat of repression and a diffuse constituency is why the unemployment issue is not easy to make politically salient. Unlike farmers, farmers can come together in a small groups and coalesce around a single issue like minimum support price. Employment, we saw a little bit in this railway demonstrations and the burning of train bogies. We saw Agniveer. So it's not that it's not there, but you're right that it has not coalesced.
But isn't it odd for a country which is so youthful? This is where bulk of our population is, and perhaps will stay for the coming decade or two. This ought to be the heavy political issue, even if it doesn't necessarily mean people coming out on the streets. But my question is, then why hasn't it dominated political narratives? We seem to be content with a temple visit by one politician or the other. I'm not saying one political party or the other. But a temple visit seems to do the trick, whether you're in opposition or in the government, as against unemployment or employment numbers. So why is that leakage there?
So, early on in the book, I also then asked what is the nature of our democracy? Because the question now you're asking is, why doesn't the democratic process
come into play?
Kickstart this issue to make it politically salient.
Okay.
So this goes back to a political theorist named Robert Dahl. And he says that democracies fail to represent the people under a few circumstances. One is if there are charismatic politicians. Charismatic politicians can get elected without necessarily catering to the needs of real people, because they carry an aura which then overrides and supersedes certain basic needs. The second, more important one is the inequalities. What does the inequality do? It sets the agenda. So the growth agenda is being set by the people you talk about. You talk about the corporate sector people. They are seeing a growth agenda. I mean, if you are in this business of earning profits for your company, you want free land, you want low interest rates, you want the prospect that your NPAs will eventually be marked down to a level where your obligations are greatly diminished. Those are your priorities. You want no fuss environmental clearances. Those are your priorities. Your priority is not job creation. But you set the agenda. You are the person financing the electoral process.
That puts a question mark on the overall democratic process itself, isn't it? I mean, at some level where we accept that just a charismatic personality or influential class setting the agenda can derail the more earthy processes of democracy and demands for democracy. But I would suspect that at long last, jobs will matter, right? I mean, if the jobs are not there in every household, then every household will get up and say, all that is fine, but what about the job?
TK, I'm not, you're asking a question, as I said, is a complex question. What has happened is that in this, there's a certain equilibrium has emerged. In that equilibrium, there are all these people that you are talking about who lack jobs, who lack quality jobs, who lack insufficient work. And there is a political process. what we have then is a group of people who are vulnerable and a group of politicians who have the ability to alleviate that vulnerability. So one of the things that scholars have found is that when you have vulnerable populations, you can appease them with gifts. So,
Handouts.
Jayalalitha would give gold coins and free laptops and all kinds of good things. And even after the Chennai floods, which caused vast devastation in Chennai, she came back. So this whole business of an electoral process where gift giving, what we are now calling freebies, there's a competition on for that. You know, you ask somebody कि तुमको किसी ने पैसे दिए इलेक्शन के टाइम पर, हाँ सब देते हैं. See, the perverse issue, the perverse outcome is that now the political parties know that they have to give money. They also know it's not going to guarantee a vote. So there is a mad scramble now. And people are promising scooties and any number of things, free electricity. So we are in this equilibrium where a vulnerable population feels beholden for those free gifts and short-sightedly is not able to see the bigger picture that, no, that's not what I want. I want a job, I want my children to be educated, I want good health care, I don't want to be trapped by police and a judicial system that is arbitrary, I want clean air. That, I mean, you're asking about jobs, and I fully understand that. But why isn't there a political agitation about clean air? So there are a lot of these vulnerabilities are subsumed.
So how is it that, other countries, say a Korea, but even more importantly a China, is able to avoid it? China could clean up its air, could, their system, which is not democratic, could respond to the Beijing air being very poor and solve it. Their system is far more responsive perhaps to job creation, per capita incomes going up, unemployment levels being lower, or it appears, nobody knows really about China. And we fail on many of these counts. Our processes, which are far more democratic, for which systems are in place, we tend to falter. Is there a lesson to somehow get over that hurdle?
Yeah, you see, let's take China, because China is really the most interesting and most important example. China became a member of the World Bank in 1981. 81 or 80, I forget. And the first World Bank report on China was written in 81, published for the public in 83. It was a remarkable report. China was just coming out of its communist phase, the post-Mao phase. The Deng reforms had really sort of maybe initially started, but not really. Shenzhen, etc. were still unknown. I in fact visited Shenzhen in 89, 90. It was still sort of, very underdeveloped, rough area. But in 81 and the 83 report, the World Bank said something terribly important. That while the communist legacy had left a lot of scars, it had educated its people, it had given them near universal health care, and the nutritional levels in a very pointed comparison with India,
Much better.
said they were much better. And the last thing, there's an expression, women hold up half the sky. That expression is attributed to Mao Zedong. Women were important members of the Communist Party committee. Women were important participants in the workforce. The one theme that I teach my students is that from the time of the Industrial Revolution to today, the last 350 years, no country, there is no exception that has made progress without two things: educating its children and increasing female workforce participation. We have consistently failed in both these. Therefore, when somebody talks about GDP growth and says to me, GDP growth hona chahiye, I said, be my guest, but sustainable GDP growth
Will not come without.
needs these two. In fact, I would go one step further and say that all this rara about high GDP growth this year is quite frankly juvenile economics. GDP growth has grown because of the fact that we had fallen and we are bouncing back. The relevant number to look at is 2019.
True.
2019, first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter, the first quarter of 2020, before COVID, the growth rate was 3.25%. You ask, when people say to me, Indian potential growth is between 6 and 8%, I said, where are you getting that number from? Oh, पिछले 20 साल में average growth. No. You can't take the average growth of the last 20 years. There were so many bubbles during that period. You have to take a point in time which is reflecting the absence of those bubbles. And if you have asked me, what is India's potential GDP growth? I will say that it is somewhere in the 4% range. That once this cloud of bizarre statistics that arise from the COVID period subsides, that I see no reason in today's condition why Indian GDP will grow at anything more than 4 or 5% at most, and possibly 3% and 4%. Therefore, this rara stuff, which is extrapolating from an extremely unusual year, is to me basic elementary economics is being forgotten.
So many of our viewers might recall that last year we did in the same series a episode with Professor Sudipto Mandal, and I asked that specific question about the 4% growth and the whole notion of the so-called Hindu rate of growth, because prior to COVID hitting our economy, we were growing at sub 4%, and it's I think a valid question to ask: what would propel India's growth once the base effects wear off, and there's a question mark in India's potential growth. But that brings me to the current government. Prime Minister Mody is seen as somebody who has the solutions in his bag. He's also seen as somebody who's likely to win another term, and BJP as a party is likely to dominate, if not stay in power necessarily, but likely to be there as the dominant party over the next few decades. But I'm thoroughly confused about Prime Minister Modi's economic outlook. You've talked about from Nehru to Indira to the current regime, and everybody has failed the people. What do you make of Prime Minister Modi's approach to economy? Because is he socialist? Is he capitalist, neoliberal? Is What do you make of the minimum government, maximum governance dictum? How do you sort of slot him?
So look, I'm very averse to this socialism, this, that, and the other. I think they're a distraction. I have looked, as you know, and although I've written my book as a history based on the characters of the principal leaders of the country, I've used a uniform lens right through. Jobs, education, health, livability of cities, international competitiveness, judicial system, clean air, clean water. I keep repeating this, I know. But if I look by those metrics, what do I see over the last 10 years? Poor job creation. What do I see in agriculture? Agriculture remains in distress. International competitiveness, India has raised its tariff rates to protect itself from external competition. A lot of people say we should have, or retrospectively should join something called the RCEP, which is the Regional Trade Agreement. Why didn't we join it? Because we are afraid to join it. It's not that should we or should we not. There was an active lobby in agriculture and industry to not join it, because we are afraid that even the modest lowering of tariff that we need will swamp our industry and agriculture. Therefore, the economy is not competitive. Is the air cleaner? Is the water cleaner? Are the rivers more successful? And again I ask, why is Joshimath sinking? So when I look at these last 10 years and I look through these measures rather than through slogans and headline grabbing catchphrases, these are the metrics I'm looking at. And I see that if anything, things have become worse. And the prospect, why, for example, do we have this thing called PLI? What is the production linked initiative or incentives? Because the premise of that is we are not competitive.
There are many repetitions of the Nehru era actually in Mr. Modi's approach to...
That is 100% correct. That is the entire growth process, the GDP growth process, has been driven by a very capital intensive set of initiatives. And more so than in the Nehru period, an extremely rampaging process of environmental destruction.
So let me just end end the interview by asking you, in terms of solutions.
Yeah.
Everybody, when we raise questions and doubts and worries about the state of the economy, the final retort is that what are the solutions? What is it that we are not doing or we should be doing? So if you could reflect a bit about, the 2-3 things you've talked about, education and labor-intensive job creation. So if you could reflect a bit on that, and also what we need to do to set the democratic process to achieve that.
Look, if I was Tsar of this country, I would say don't do anything for the next 5 years until you've got a world-class education system. Why is Vietnam going ahead of us? Everyone talks about production moving to India from China, but it's already moved to Vietnam, it's moving to Bangladesh, it's moving to Cambodia, it's moving to Mexico. You need educated workers. This idea that we can develop on the cheap without educating our children is absurd. Okay. But I know that's not going to happen because it's not happened. Why is Joshimath sinking? Why is education not fixed? My diagnosis through the book is that the core democratic problem has been a steady erosion of social norms and public accountability. That the problem is not in the policy solutions. Who doesn't know how to fix the rivers? Who doesn't know how to fix the Ghazipur landfill? Who doesn't know how to fix to clean the Ganga or the Yamuna? Everybody knows the answers. But the accountability that is needed is missing. And so I end by saying, look, I don't know that there is a magic wand over here. But the closest I can see is the practice of decentralized governance in Kerala. The virtue of that is that it brings the people who are governed close to those who are governing them. And that proximity creates a certain degree of accountability. And what I'm saying is that we need to institutionalize a set of norms that are morally grounded and that create a degree of mutual sense of obligation within a group that it can be administratively and governmentally coordinated. And then my hope would be that seeing that example flourish, that others say, you know, this is working well, we should also do this. And that it percolates both horizontally and it percolates up. Absent that, all the talk about labor-intensive production, etc., will falter. Because as long as there aren't more women in the workforce, as long as there aren't better educated kids, I will assure you that we'll be having this conversation 30 years from now. I might not be here, but you will be having this conversation with somebody like me at that time. Therefore, it is the fixing of norms and accountability. Sometimes people will say to me, governance reform hona chahiye. And I said, governance reform karega kaun? Unaccountable politicians do not impose accountability on themselves. It's not in their interest. Therefore, we need to create an accountability so that known technical solutions can be implemented and pursued. That pursuit of those. This idea that there's a headline grabbing moment at which we have solved the problem. No, that's bullshit. You have to pursue over a period of years. The development process is hard and unforgiving. And we need to engage in that.
So, thank you, Professor Mody. I think I have many more questions, but we have completely run out of time, massively overshot it actually. To all the viewers, I would again recommend reading the book. It will give you pause and it will make you think about the reality that we have and what we need to change, and look at policy making from a different light. And at the heart of it is a very simple idea. If you were to go away from GDP, not that we do always terribly so good in GDP, but if you were to change the metric from GDP to unemployment or employment, the reality around us will totally change. It's like putting a different pair of glasses and the whole thing totally changes. And which is the lived reality that you would see around you. And you have to ask yourself whether this economy is working for you. And if it's not, then what needs to change? Because as the book details, it's a long history from Nehru to Prime Minister Modi, where the system has failed on delivering on basic employment needs. On that note, we want to close the episode. Thanks again, sir, for
Thank you.
sparing
Thank
the
you
time.
very much. I really appreciate it. Yes.
And if you like this episode, please press like, share it with your friends. That's a best way for us to understand and reach out to a greater audience. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.